based on inaccurate perceptions that Muslims wish to have a parallel society rather than being part of the mainstream. It has also led many to believe that the state or the legal system need to step in to regulate the participants of Muslims. However, it will be argued that the research indicates the exact opposite, which many Muslims developing an Australian Islamic identity and actively seeking way to combine their religious belief whilst being a part of the Australian society. And in this way, having multicultural policies can actually contribute to the greater cohesion. There has been a growing focus on multiculturalism in recent times, with many Western political leaders questioning its usefulness as an instrument of state policy. In Australian context, it has been evidence, at least since the beginning of the Howard era, and has continued regardless of the political party in power to one extent or another. When we look deeper into the debate, what becomes very clear is that the worry is not fact about other cultures, but is now almost entirely about Muslims and whether or not they can integrate into a Western liberal society. For some, Islam is inherently incompatible with the West, and any attempt to afford special treatment as multiculturalism is now seen as necessarily going to be socially divisive. Whether the discussion is about food or dress or the building of mosques, there is now set formula to how it goes. A formula that draws links, as tenuous as they may be, from how different Muslims are, how terrible events are unfolding overseas involving Muslims, then to various assertion that Muslims are seeking to change our way of life, rather than themselves adapting and then ending with a call to protecting Australian value, whatever they may be. The research finds no evidence whatsoever of a campaign by the Muslim community for changes in law or policies to accommodate their religion need. There has never been a bill presented to any parliament of the country to see to this effect. There has never been a formal submission by any organization for any such legislative change, with one exception. That being a single statement is submission by the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils to a review on religious discrimination, asking for more recognition of Islamic family law principles. There has been no such call when it comes to halal certification, because it is easily catered for under existing processes. There has never been a call for legalize, for once a better word, Islamic dress, for its breaches not existing law. In fact, aside from the issue of family law, the only area that appears to be calling for some form of accommodation is the area of Islamic finance. What is interesting in that this is not being driven by the community itself, but by the general finance sector, and in some respects the government. The reason for this is clear. Without accommodating financial regulation to cater for Islamic principle, Australia risks missing out of a piece of the estimate of 4.2 trillion US dollars. Islamic Finance Market 2014. It is facts clear that the Australian Muslim community is not demanding any special accommodation at all. What are seen as accommodation are in fact the community defending its existing right under current law to participate in its religion as any other citizen does. Example of this including the calls to ban the veil or the headscarf, to remove the halal certification, or to prohibit the building of mosques and community centers. That is all respects comply with existing planning regulations. These are not called for accommodation, but pleased to be permitted to continue enjoy the same freedom of religion as other group. Another argument constantly put forward in that multiculturalism or accommodating minority leads to the civil instability. Muslim communities are now being used as example to support this. We obviously disagree strongly with this position. This is supported by recent research coming out of the University of Queensland that found Muslims who had a strong connection with their local mosque and felt they could practice their faith has a direct and strong connection with their Australian identity and were active citizens. We believe that the more accepting general society is the minorities, the greater level of civic participation and hence to commonalities between all groups become stronger and form the national identity. This is supported by the research mentioned earlier and other research coming out of the University of Victoria. That research looked at the level of active civic participation of Muslims in Australia and Germany, and the finding clearly showed that the myth that Muslims will not or do not participate in broader civic life is not true. In fact, it finds that the level of civic involvement of Muslim Australia, when looking at volunteers, for example, is far higher than the national average. We say that it is multicultural policies of Australia, those very policies that are being challenged today, that have been created an environment that has enabled Muslims to do this. And yet, we still find ourselves at the heart of the debate on multiculturalism. Why? The most obvious answer is that global event, particularly terrorism-related and the rising level of Islamophobia, has had a significant and disproportionate impact on this issue. Let's consider some facts of the terrorism issue and the risk it poses to Western society. The Global Terrorism Data Index, an independent research group based out of the University of Maryland in the US, has been collecting data on terrorism in 1970. Looking at Europe, North America, and Oceania. What would generally be acknowledged as the West, the data show, for the period from 1990 to 2014, so it doesn't include recent incidents, less than 4% of all terrorist activities were conducted by Muslims. The number of terrorist activities in the region spiked post the second Iraqi invasion and has actually tapered off since then. According to FBI statistic, for the US, 7% of all domestic terrorist activity in the US were by radical Jews and opposed to 6% by Muslims. Let's be clear, violent extremism is a significant issue for Western nations, and there is no doubt that acts of violent extremism and terrorism have been committed and are likely to continue into the future by people who identify as Muslim. The important point to note, however, is that overwhelming number of this event has not been taking place in Western countries, but in predominantly Muslim places that are, if not war zone, certainly very close to it. In Western nations, overall Islamic violent extremism, despite the disproportionate attention it receives in mass media, is no more of risk and in fact is less of risk than many other forms of violence extremism, both religiously and politically motivated. There have been at least a dozen cases in Australia over the last 5 years of action, if done by Muslims, would undoubtedly be considered terrorism. The fact is that there have been by far and away more acts, both actual and planned, of terrorist-like behavior committed in Australia by non-Muslim than Muslim. And of course, we have seen the increasing level of far-right terrorism across the globe. Obviously, Christchurch is the closest to home for us. So why has Islam and Muslims become the center of this discussion. Islam and Muslims are easily identifiable other. The West's anxiety about the other, where diversity is something to be feared, not admired. Islam is conceived as other. Culture or civilization most at odds with and therefore the most threatening to society. Essentially, this is describing the growing incidence of Islamophobia at both an individual and structural level. This is a not post-9/11 phenomenon, though it certainly has dramatically increased since then. The war and terror post-9/11, the subsequent increase in terrorism-related incidents, disproportionate media focus on Islam, related terrorism as opposed to other terror-related activities have all contributed to an environment where the place of Muslim minority is constantly under question. Research shows that ethnic minorities associated with Islam in most Western countries have experienced increased negative attention from the media, police and security forces, and indeed from agitated citizens. There have been a clear and observable increase in anti-Muslims or Islamophobic hate crime, racial vilification, and discrimination. Another significant contributor has been the framing of this issue almost entirely as one of the securitization and threat management. Suddenly, every Muslim is a potential threat that we need to be secure from. The Australian government over the 2014 and 2015 financial year earmarked well over $1.4 billion additional funding for security purposes, as opposed to $13 million for social programs. And almost all of this is focused on securing the Muslim community despite the generality of language and law. It is any wonder that the multiculturalism debate has gone the way it has. The development of Muslim identity free from these external factors is, we believe, critically important. Important to counter the extremist narrative itself, but also to maximize the benefit of growing minority within the Australian culture. As I said earlier, religious Muslims are more civically active and connected to their Australian identity than other groups. States need to be continued to explore ways to accommodate such minorities so that they can fully take their place in society. Yes, it will be inevitable lead to the societal and cultural shifts, but this is what multicultural societies need to do. The yearning of some for monocultural Australia, forced or otherwise, is both problematic and too late. Regardless of any government policy, Australia has ceased being a monoculture since the white Australian policy was discarded some 50 years ago. The trend ever since has been an increase in the multitudinous nature of our cultures. The only question is how we manage this diversity rather than whether it should exist or not. Successful accommodation in the form of recognition and as a process of mutual knowing is transformative of both the mainstream society and the minority group. It is a two-way process that requires the mainstream society to adapt itself to minority group just as those groups must adapt to the mainstream. In this way, it is accepted that culture is not static but adaptive and that culture evolution is the normal state of affairs. It is important to remember that policies are not about entrenching or preserving a particular culture. Rather, they are supporting the institutions that are of importance for those cultures to be sustained and to develop naturally. Thank you very much.